This is perhaps the most well-known Masonic symbol, the square and compass. Low-level Masons are told that the G stands for God or geometry, which the great architect used to design the universe, but the real hidden meaning is that it's representative of the sex act, as usual. The letter G stands for generation or generative power. Albert Pike writes in Morals and Dogma that sexual union could be represented by the letter G, the generative principle. This term, generative principle, is code for the sex act. Pike goes on to explain that the compass, therefore, is the hermetic symbol of the creative deity, and the square of the productive earth or universe. Therefore, the Masons look at the compass as a male element and the square as the female element, which interact to produce the G in the middle. The square and compass is also an adaptation of the most wicked symbol of all, the hexagram. Historian John J. Robinson reveals in his book, Born in Blood, The Lost Secrets of Freemasonry, that the Mason's compass is nothing more than the satanic hexagram with some key pieces removed. As Robinson points out, the Mason began with a fully formed hexagram and then simply removed the horizontal bar from each interlocking triangle. The upper triangle was then stylized into a compass, while the bottom triangle was made into a square. Finally, he placed a G in the middle to represent the generative force of the male and female together. In this next example, we see they put a sun god in the middle instead of the G. The full hexagram is also used in Freemasonry. Masonic author Albert Mackey tells of the sexual connotation of this hexagram. The triangle pointing downward is a female symbol corresponding to the yoni, and the upward pointing triangle is the male, the lingam. When the two triangles are interlaced, it represents the union of the active and passive forces in nature. It represents the male and female elements. The upward pointing male triangle is represented by light, and the downward facing female triangle is dark. They interlock again with a sexual connotation. These symbols have many layers, and nothing is there without great thought and attention. The hexagram also represents the number of the beast, which is 666, because it has 6 points, 6 sides, and 6 angles. Notice also the T or Tau within this particular hexagram. T represents Tammuz, the product of the union between the sun god and moon goddess. The little circle on top of the T also turns this symbol into an Ankh cross. The Ankh in occultism is representative of the life-giving power of the sun. It's also worth highlighting that this male and female, light and dark duality concept has survived in the Eastern forms of the Babylonian religion, such as Buddhism. For example, we are probably very familiar with the yin and yang symbol here. In this symbol, the light side of course represents the male aspect and the dark side represents the female aspect. This again is a sexual symbol, and it's very commonly used in the world today. This black and white motif is represented another way in Freemasonry through checked floors. This is a suitable way of hiding its true meaning from the profane. Albert Pike said the black and white pavement symbolizes the good and evil principles of the Egyptian and Persian creed. It is the warfare of Michael and Satan, light and shadow, which is darkness, day and night, freedom and despotism. The all-seeing eye, or Lucifer, is behind both Baal and Asherah, which means he's behind both the light and the dark. Good and evil, or light and dark, coming from the same source, is a satanic concept. This next photo is a great example of the double meaning of symbols. Look at the floor and you'll see the black and white checks, but you'll also notice a pentagram. An upright pentagram denotes man, Adam and Eve, and this is considered to be the light side. Turn the pentagram upside down, however, and it represents the dark horned goat of Satan, Baphomet. Now look at the photo again. From our viewpoint on this side of the camera, we see the pentagram as upright, which denotes a light organisation working for the good of man. And this is how Freemasons portray themselves in public. They like to point out the good they do in the community. From the perspective of the Masons on the other side of the camera, however, and from their side of the floor, they see something quite different in that symbol. From their side, looking towards us, the pentagram is inverted, which is depicting Baphomet and the real dark agenda of the organisation. What they see is different to what they present to us to see. Occultists of all types will frequently be seen to be very generous in public. They will become involved with charities, donate freely with their time and money, and generally perform acts that will endear themselves to the public. For example, it was widely reported in recent years that Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling was the most generous giver to charity in the whole of Scotland. This invites statements such as, well, if she gives so much to charity, she can't possibly be a bad person. Harry Potter can't be anything to worry about. We have to remember it is always in their best interests to present a light side to the public which draws empathy and trust, but which masks a dark hidden agenda. Freemasons also wear an apron within their lodges, and again we should now easily be able to make sense of the imagery contained on it. But the aprons are in fact double-sided, like this. The light front side is seen openly, but then contrast it with a hidden dark side that is concealed from view. One thing on the surface, another thing in reality. This quote from Masonic author Carl Cloudy sums it all up. Cut through the outer shell and find a meaning. Cut through that meaning and find another. Under it, if you dig deep enough, you may find a third, a fourth. Who shall say how many teachings? In his typically deceptive way, Satan hides meanings within meanings within meanings, so that darkness becomes light and light darkness. His intention is always to lead people away from the truth and towards their destruction. He is a master of deception. Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma cuts to the chase when he exclaims, this idea of seeking the light is an interesting one because it sounds vaguely Christian on the surface. When Masons talk about moving towards the light, however, they're talking about moving towards the so-called illuminating knowledge of Lucifer, which is in fact darkness. You may hear politicians using this leitmotif from time to time. Alice A. Bailey, one of the most prominent occultists of the 20th century, wrote in her book, The Externalization of the Hierarchy, the Masonic fraternity is the home of the mysteries and the seat of the initiation. It is a far more occult organization than can be realized, and is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists. She then goes on to say, every Masonic lodge is a temple of religion and its teaching instruction in religion. Masonry is the successor to the mysteries. It can't be made any clearer than that. Alice Bailey, incidentally, was one of the most influential New Agers of the 20th century. Indeed, she invented the term New Age, and wrote over 25 books by channeling from a demonic spirit guide. We'll find out more about her later in the United Nations section, but for now we only need to know that she knows what she's talking about when she talks about occult themes. She then goes on to say, there is no question, therefore, that the work to be done in familiarizing the general public with the nature of the mysteries is of paramount importance at this time. These mysteries will be restored to outer expression through the medium of the Church and the Masonic fraternity. When the Great One comes with his disciples and initiates, we shall have the restoration of the mysteries and their exoteric presentation as a consequence of the first initiation. Henry R. Evans writes, into Freemasonry have been poured the irradiations of the mystical schools of antiquity. Particularly is this so in the higher degrees of the order, such as the Scottish Rite, where undeniable traces of Kabbalism, Neoplatonism, Rosicrucianism and other mystical cults are plainly discernible. I do personally contend that Freemasonry is the direct descendant of the mysteries, but that our ritual makers of the higher degrees have copied the ancient ceremonies of initiation so far as the knowledge of those ceremonies exists. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, said, "Masonic orders have contained the most influential men in many governments, and virtually every occult order has many Masonic roots." Now finally watch this clip of a Freemason admitting on camera that he believes Lucifer is the source of light and that he is helping mankind. In particular, note his confusion.
Lucifer, what is your problem?
Just that, sir.
Okay.
I'm a Christian, sir.
I'm pure and virtuous and wholesome and innocent. How can you say anything bad about me?
Sir, you need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you were Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, define Lucifer for me.
Pure, virtuous, wholesome, innocent individual that's out to help people.
Lucifer is?
Yeah.
Say that again. Lucifer is a pure, holy,
Virtuous.
virtuous. Now, is he the Lucifer that God created?
That's the same one.
Oh, man, this is great. I'm going to put this on the internet.
Oh,
Amen.
God bless you,
Amen.
brother.
Because that's exactly what the Shriners and Masons teach, is that Lucifer is light.
No.
And you're,
What
you're
about those
confirming it.
hospitals?
You know what, sir? Jesus said, "Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, we did not do these good deeds in your name? And you'll say, away from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you."
Jesus said it?
In Matthew chapter 5.
Mercy.
No.
That's hard to believe.
So you're a Christian and you don't know that. Actually,
No, I really am.
you are.
Because I'm pure and virtuous.
You're pure and virtuous, okay. Yeah. In other words, you're perfect without Jesus, right?
No.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Well, he's my leader.
Is he the Son of God?
Yes, he
Is he the only worshipful master?
Yes.
Have you ever been called worshipful master?
No, because I've just been too busy. I've been working.
Working.
Been working to help people.
What
like
kind of
you.
work? Okay.
Get out of here.
See, this is what a Mason confesses, is that Lucifer is light. You heard it?
So we've learned about the nature of the Freemasons and Illuminati, and we've learned about their aim to destroy Christianity and monarchies. The question then is, what did they want to replace them with? What kind of society were these enlightened individuals after? What would the new system look like in the secular New World Order they were trying to create? The answer to these questions are found in the writings of the classical Greek philosopher Plato. Plato's beliefs in turn were based on the mysteries as handed down through the Persians and his predecessor Pythagoras. Plato's most famous book is in fact called The Republic, and in this and his other works he has much to say on how a society should be run. The so-called illuminated ones took much inspiration from it for their vision of a new world order. So here are some key ideas from that book. Firstly, Plato believed that society should be divided into a hierarchy of 3 levels: the ruling elite, the auxiliaries, and the workers. It's more like a 2-tier system really, as there is no middle class as such. The middle tier just exists to impose the will of the upper tier on the lower. Plato believed that the average individual was incapable of running his own life, and that they should therefore submit unquestioningly to the ruling elite who, because of their superior and enlightened knowledge, would direct their lives for the greater good. He wrote, "And even in the smallest manner, one should stand under leadership. For example, he should get up or move or wash or take his meals only if he has been told to do so. In a word, he should teach his soul by long habit never to dream of acting independently. There will be no end to the trouble of states or of humanity itself till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus comes into the same hands." What Plato was effectively describing here was a totalitarian state, a socialistic dictatorship. Plato believed that average men were nothing more than labouring beasts of the field, fit for nothing else but slavery. He believed that not all men were equal, and that only a small number of elites at the top of the hierarchy were fit to rule. Sound familiar? Those elites were those who were philosophers, i.e., those with the greatest capacity for knowledge. To Plato, it was knowledge that made one man higher than another. Again, I need to emphasize that the middle class is effectively abolished in the system. There's a small top tier that rules and a large bottom tier that is subservient, and then simply a group in the middle to implement it, like the army or police. Look at the economics of the world today and you will notice the middle class gradually being squeezed with higher taxes and greater debt burdens. The elite bankers caused a global financial crisis but were bailed out, and within a couple of years they were operating like nothing had happened, paying out just as large bonuses as ever. The middle class, meanwhile, are left with the tab by way of huge tax increases. During the financial crisis, you will notice that the very wealthy did not have to adjust their lifestyles at all. The gap between rich and poor widened. I won't go into that any further right now, but it is likely that the middle class will eventually be eradicated if they have their way. Plato also says, "We must look for the right kind of rule in one or two or very few men, whenever such right rule occurs. And these men, whether they rule over willing or unwilling subjects, with or without written laws, and whether they are rich or poor, must exercise their rule in accordance with some art or science. And whether they purge the state for its good by killing or banishing some of the citizens, or make it smaller by sending out colonies somewhere, as bees swarm from the hive, or bring in citizens from elsewhere to make it larger, so long as they act in accordance with science and justice, and preserve and benefit it by making it better than it was, so far as is possible, that must at that time and by such characteristics be declared to be the only right form of government." So chillingly here, Plato believed that those at the top of the hierarchy could manipulate, kill and control human beings as they wished, as long as it was for the greater good. Remember the satanic mantra that the end justifies the means. He states that it doesn't matter whether the masses are willing or unwilling to be ruled, and that they may be justly killed or banished in order to control populations. In Plato's eyes, the individual exists merely for the benefit of the state. They have no intrinsic value of their own. He also suggests that a tyrant is necessary to protect people from themselves. Here's a key statement. "Philosopher kings must take the city and the characters of men as they might a tablet, and first wipe it clean. No easy task. But at any rate you know that this would be the first point of difference from ordinary reformers, that they would refuse to take in hand either individual or state, or to legislate before they either received a clean slate or themselves made it clean." In other words, in order for this new world order of things to be introduced, the former way of things must first be wiped out. They must start with a clean slate. One way of wiping out the old is a kind of brainwashing through propaganda, dominating flows of information. He writes, "Rhetoric is a producer of persuasion for belief, not for instruction in the matter of right and wrong. And so the rhetorician's business is not to instruct a law court or a public meeting in matters of right and wrong, but only to make them believe." So the idea is not to tell people what is truly right and wrong, but only to make them believe what it is you want them to believe in order that they might be best manipulated for your own specific end. This is morally acceptable as long as the end justifies the means. This is compounded when he says, "The profession of those who are greatest in wisdom, who are called orators and lawyers, for they persuade men by the art which they possess, not teaching them, but making them have whatever opinion they like." Plato praises those who have such smooth words of persuasion that they can make people conform their opinions to anything they wish. A barrier to wiping the slate clean, however, is parents who hold to the old value system. Therefore, Plato suggests, all inhabitants above the age of 10 they will send out into the fields, and they will take over the children, remove them from the manners and habits of their parents, and bring them up in their own customs and laws, which will be such as we have described. This is the speediest and easiest way in which such a city and constitution as we have portrayed could be established and prosper, and bring most benefit to the people among whom it arises. So here Plato suggests that children should be taken away from their parents and raised by the state who know better, and who will instruct them in the ways required to bring about change. Not the truth about right and wrong, simply the ideas that will manipulate their minds into believing what they want them to believe. Also, like the Jesuits, who are ordered in military style, Plato believed that society should have a similar kind of structure. Notice how closely this passage mirrors the Jesuit philosophy. Military organization is the subject of much consultation and of many appropriate laws. The main principle is this, that nobody, male or female, should ever be left without control, nor should anyone, whether at work or play, grow habituated in mind to acting alone and on his own initiative, but he should live always, both in war and peace, with his eyes fixed constantly on his commander and following his lead, and he should be guided by him even in the smallest details of his actions. For example, to stand at the word of command, and to march, and to exercise, to wash and eat, to wake up at night for sentry duty and dispatch carrying, and in moments of danger to wait for the commander's signal before either pursuing or retreating before an enemy. And in a word, he must instruct his soul by habituation to avoid all thought or idea of doing anything at all apart from the rest of his company, so that the life of all shall be lived en masse and in common. For there is not, nor ever will be, any rule superior to this, or better and more effective in ensuring safety and victory in war. This task of ruling and being ruled by others must be practiced in peace from earliest childhood, but anarchy must be utterly removed from the lives of all mankind. The words of that quotation could easily have come from Ignatius Loyola. Notice that the individual is so heavily de-emphasized, and that it is all about the collective. Plato also believed that because all humans were not equal, there should be a breeding program of the finest, designed to improve the qualities of the human species. Only the best were to procreate. Those humans who it was believed had undesirable traits should not. This is called eugenics. You have in your house hunting dogs and a number of pedigree cocks. Do not some prove better than the rest? Do you then breed from all indiscriminately, or are you careful to breed from the best? And again, do you breed from the youngest or the oldest, or, so far as may be, from those in their prime? And if they are not thus bred, you expect, do you not, that your birds and hounds will greatly degenerate? And what of horses and other animals? Is it otherwise with them? How imperative then is our need of the highest skill in our rulers, if the principle holds also for mankind? The best men must cohabit with the best women in as many cases as possible, and the worst with the worst in the fewest, and that the offspring of the one must be reared and that of the other not, if the flock is to be as perfect as possible. And the way in which all this is brought to pass must be unknown to any but the rulers, if again the herd of guardians is to be as free as possible from dissension. He went even further, suggesting that the offspring of inferior humans should be disposed of like a piece of trash. The offspring of the inferior, and any of those of the other sort who are born defective, they will properly dispose of in secret, so that no one will know what has become of them. That is the condition of preserving the purity of the guardian's breed. Eugenics is what Adolf Hitler was doing when he tried to establish a master race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan humans. This process involved trying to eradicate those who he saw as inferior, specifically the Jews. Plato elaborates, saying, "The bride and bridegroom must set their minds to produce for the state children of the greatest possible goodness and beauty." So they are to procreate for just 10 years, at the end of which they are considered too old to produce any more, and are forcibly divorced. If the couple don't agree to do this, then Plato suggests that wardens, partly by threat and partly by admonition, stop them. If the man refuses in the face of these threats, he is to be disqualified from attending his children's birthday parties and any weddings. If he does appear at these events, then people are entitled to punish him with blows, and the same was to apply to women. Plato also believed that marriage and the family unit should be completely abolished, saying, "All these women shall be wives in common to all the men, and not one of them shall live privately with any man. The children too should be held in common, so that no parent shall know which is his own offspring, and no child shall know his parent." Now these ideas of Plato's aren't just ancient, scary but irrelevant ideas from thousands of years ago. These mystery ideas about a new society became the prevailing views of the Enlightenment era and the foundation of what these illuminated individuals set out to achieve. The kind of society being described by Plato is the one that elite occultists everywhere are still trying to engineer. We can see how closely Plato's ideas match the ideas of the Illuminati when we consider their stated main goals. Dr. Timothy Dwight says, "In the societies of Illuminati, the being of God was denied and ridiculed. The possession of property was pronounced to be robbery. Adultery, assassination, poisoning, and other crimes of like infernal nature were taught as lawful and even as virtuous actions. To crown such a system of falsehood and horror, all means were declared to be lawful, provided the end was good. Of the goodness of the end every man is to judge for himself. The great and good ends proposed by the Illuminati are the overthrow of religion, government, and human society, civil and domestic. These they pronounce to be so good that murder and war, however extended and dreadful, are declared by them to be completely justifiable, if necessary for these great purposes." So once more we see the idea that anything goes if the end justifies the means. We could call these Plato-inspired societies knowledge dictatorships, or as Freemason Aldous Huxley called them in Brave New World Revisited, science dictatorships. The word science just comes from the Latin word for knowledge. Just as operative Freemasons knew that having a monopoly on trade secrets gave them power and position when building cathedrals and churches, speculative Freemasons equally understood that having a monopoly on knowledge and science would give them power to rule in these new republics. The Catholic Church had done the exact same thing in the Dark Ages. They tried to monopolize knowledge and learning to gain and retain power. From a spiritual perspective, Satan will always try and gain control of the flow of information, because by doing that, he can control what people think, which will automatically control how they behave. Since people were turning away from the Catholic Church to science for understanding now, Satan had to change tack and get control of the information flows in science. In The Architecture of Modern Political Power, Daniel Putzner outlines the tactics employed by the Masonic elite. Among them, he says, is ostensible control over the knowable by marketing institutionally accredited science as the only path to true understanding. Thus, the ruling class endeavours to discourage independent reason while exercising illusory power over human knowledge. This tactic of control through knowledge suppression and selective dissemination is reiterated in the anonymously authored document Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. The bookkeeper can be king if the public can be kept ignorant of the methodology of the bookkeeping. All science is merely a means to an end. The means is knowledge. The end is control. So take this example. Scientific institutions tell us that we have a man-made climate change problem. Now, whether this is true or not, how many individual human beings have actually bothered to study the data or do their own research? Very few. The mass of humanity believes we have a man-made climate change problem because scientific institutions have said so, and the mass media has passed the information on. This feeling that there are trustworthy experts in control of the information, bookkeepers as it were, stops the average person from going to it themselves. Just like people in the Dark Ages believed the church was trustworthy and therefore there was no need to go to the Bible themselves. Also, just like the Bible was shrouded behind impenetrable Latin then, so science is shrouded behind jargon and theories too complex for most people to bother with now. Effectively, we just say to the institutions, you just tell us what it says and we'll believe you. But what if, like Plato suggested, they don't give us the truth but only the information that will best manipulate us to achieve their goals? What if the end justifies the means? That's the essence of scientific or knowledge dictatorships. Those at the top are to have that secret serpent knowledge promised in the Garden of Eden, and they are to use it to control the mass of people below who are to be kept in ignorance. The masses were not to be fed the truth, but false information that made them believe they had the truth. Stephen Hawking once said that the enemy of true knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. If we think we already have it, we don't bother digging any deeper. By this method, people can be effectively manipulated and dominated. This is the foundation of satanic societies and institutions since Babylon. It's the same old pyramid structure, the kind which the Catholic Church employed to keep the masses in darkness in the Dark Ages. People just replaced a religious dictatorship with a scientific one. Independent thought was to be banished in the Enlightenment, and instead institutional science was to be used to control what the Muggles knew and what they believed. Aldous Huxley wrote in Brave New World Revisited that, Under a scientific dictatorship, education will really work, with the result that most men and women will grow up to love their servitude and will never dream of revolution. There seems to be no good reason why a thoroughly scientific dictatorship should ever be overthrown. The priests of Roman Catholicism were merely replaced by a new breed of bookkeepers or information guardians on whom people would rely for knowledge. Jim Keith writes, "As the sun-moon cult lost some of its popularity, scientists were quick to take up some of the slack. According to their propaganda, the physical laws of the universe were the ultimate causative factors, and naturally, those physical laws were only fathomable by the scientific elite. Just as Latin was beyond the understanding of the average person, so was science. As the people moved away from religion, science was presented to fill the void, and in doing so, the elite simply created a new type of religion called scientism. This is the idea that science explains everything and is the answer to everything, even when science itself can't support that worldview. Much of what we call science today is actually scientism, a mere philosophy masquerading as scientific truth." This new scientific religious system had two requirements: a false science in which people would put their trust, and secondly, an official institution to accredit, control and disseminate it to the masses. That institution was the British Royal Society. Virtually all the Royal Society's founding members were Freemasons. One could reasonably argue that the Royal Society itself, at least in its inception, was a Masonic institution. The Royal Society was to be a kind of propaganda machine, a forerunner to the modern-day media, who would sculpt and shape public opinion through the notions about science that they controlled and disseminated. The Royal Society was to science what the Catholic Church had been to Christianity in the Dark Ages. With the British Royal Society acting as the headquarters of the propaganda machine, they now needed to introduce the science itself. That science was Darwinism, or evolution. Given that the founding members of the Royal Society were Freemasons, whatever science they came up with would only be an extension of their occult doctrine. The theory of evolution is nothing less. In The Meaning of Masonry, W. Elm Wilmhurst reveals the worldview underpinning the new Masonic science. This, the evolution of man into Superman, was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries, and the real purpose of modern Masonry is not the social and charitable purposes to which so much attention is paid, but the expediting of the spiritual evolution of those who aspire to perfect their own nature and transform it into a more godlike quality. And this is a definite science, a royal art, which it is possible for each of us to put into practice, whilst to join the craft for any other purpose than to study and pursue the science is to misunderstand its meaning. Later in the book, Wilmhurst reiterates this theme. Man who has sprung from earth and developed through the lower kingdoms of nature to his present rational state has yet to complete his evolution by becoming a godlike being and unifying his consciousness with the omniscient, to promote which is and always has been the sole aim and purpose of all initiation. The spiritual implications of the theory of evolution are something that few people ever stop to consider, so I want to really highlight this. What was the lie from the serpent in the Garden of Eden? It was that by attainment of knowledge, by our own efforts, we would become as gods. Now what does evolution teach? It teaches that we are constantly evolving onwards and upwards over time, and if we are constantly evolving throughout time, where is the end goal? Surely the end goal is when man has reached absolute perfection. We cannot evolve beyond perfection. And what is another name for absolute perfection other than godhood? Evolution is the exact lie from the Garden of Eden, that mankind can become perfect or godlike by our own efforts through knowledge, or science you may call it. Through the idea of evolution, Freemasons introduced the occult idea of becoming to the masses under the veil of science, the belief that man is gradually evolving towards enlightened godhood. What many also don't know is that the basic idea of evolution did not originate with Charles Darwin. According to Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, it originated with his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Dr. Erasmus Darwin was the first man in England to suggest those ideas, which were later to be embodied in the Darwinian theory by his grandson, Charles Darwin, who wrote in 1859, Origin of Species. Now, Erasmus Darwin was the founder of the Masonic Lunar Society. According to author Ian Taylor, the Lunar Society was active from about 1764 to 1800, and its prominent influence continued long afterwards under the banner of the British Royal Society. The group's name owed itself to the fact that the members met monthly at the time of the full moon, which suggests some kind of link to the goddess Ashura again. The membership of this group boasted such luminaries as John Wilkinson, James Watt, Matthew Boulton, Joseph Priestley, Josiah Wedgwood, and Benjamin Franklin. These men, along with other members, were given the title Merchants of Light. Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry says, before coming to Derby in 1788, Dr. Darwin had been made a Mason in the famous time immemorial lodge of Canongate, Kilwinning, No. 2 of Scotland. Sir Francis Darwin, one of the Doctor's sons, was made a Mason in Tyrian Lodge No. 253 at Derby in 1807 or 1808. His son Reginald was made a Mason in Tyrian Lodge in 1804. The name of Charles Darwin does not appear on the rolls of the lodge, but it is very possible that he, like Francis, was a Mason. In 1794, Erasmus Darwin wrote a book called Zoonomia, where he expanded upon his theory of evolution. It was based on the occult concept of becoming, the gradual process of attaining godhood. Even before then, however, John Locke, a prominent Freemason and member of the British Royal Society, had taken the Hindu idea of reincarnation, which had been brought to Britain by the East India Trading Company, and formulated his own ideas on evolution based on it. The British Royal Society accepted his ideas, and they also received the support of the male members of the Darwin family at the time. 2 centuries later, this occult concept of becoming would be transmitted to Charles Darwin, and the Origin of Species would be born. So the evolutionary theory clearly had occult roots that predated Charles Darwin by a long way. These occult ideas were developed by Freemasons before Darwin brought it to public attention with his book. Now remember, the reason that we had deism was at least partly because people couldn't explain the origins of life without some kind of God. The general population understood that things don't just pop into existence uncaused. If we came home and found an elephant in our house, the first thing we'd ask is, who put it there? How did it get in the house? We understand that elephants don't just pop into existence. Things which begin to exist always have a cause. Therefore, one of the key problems for the evolutionary theory to solve was how life could arise from non-living matter. If life could come from chemicals by some kind of natural and undirected reaction, the need for God to explain the origin of life was eliminated. This concept is called spontaneous generation. It was the only way evolution could even get off the ground. Louis Pasteur wrote, "To bring about spontaneous generation would be to create a germ. It would be creating life. It would be to solve the problem of its origin. It would mean to go from matter to life through conditions of environment and of matter. God as author of life would then no longer be needed. Matter would replace him. God would need to be invoked only as author of the motions of the universe." Could the origin of life be explained without God? That was the key question. Well, after scientific testing, the idea of spontaneous generation was quickly destroyed and proved to be impossible by the law of biogenesis. It just couldn't happen. No mixture of chemicals or non-living matter ever produced life. This disaster should have meant that the theory never got off the ground. However, this didn't stop men of science from defying nature, even to this day. Evolution still has no answer for the origin of life, and the whole enterprise continues on blind faith. This is an example of science becoming scientism, a philosophy masquerading as undisputed fact. Perhaps it is epitomized by the following quotation from Dr. George Wald, a Nobel Prize-winning evolutionist in the field of biology and Professor Emeritus of Biology at Harvard University. There are only two possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation, that life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproved 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others. That leaves us with the only possible conclusion that life arose as a creative act of God. I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. All evidence still pointed towards some kind of mind being behind the world. Charles Darwin himself unconsciously revealed this in statements like, "Natural selection picks out with unerring skill the best varieties." Statements like these suggest that nature has a mind. Only something with a mind can pick out or make any kind of decision at all. And if we're talking about something with a mind, what we're actually talking about is God. The idea that lifeless matter spontaneously generates life is actually found in an ancient Kabbalah concept called the golem. Isaac Singer writes, "The golem is based on faith that dead matter is not really dead, but can be brought to life. What are the computers and robots of our time if not golems? The Talmud tells us of an interpreter by the name of Rava who formed a man by this mysterious power. We are living in an epoch of golem making right now. The gap between science and magic is becoming narrower." In the article, Towards a New Science of Life, EIR journalist Jonathan Tenenbaum makes the following statement. "Now, it is easy to show that Darwinism, one of the pillars of modern biology, is nothing but a kind of cult, a cult religion. I am not exaggerating. It has no scientific validity whatsoever. Darwin's so-called theory of evolution is based on absurdly irrational propositions, which did not come from scientific observations, but were artificially introduced from the outside for political, ideological reasons. Charles Darwin is a kind of prophet for scientism, who preached a new gospel, which is in fact the oldest lie of all time, that we're attaining godhood through enlightened knowledge, or becoming, as occultists call it. The Royal Society presented the theory to the world as undisputed fact, and today the media and education systems do the same. Most people have a blind faith in evolution simply because it's what they have been told is true. And this is exactly the plan. The masses are being manipulated by the controlled information flows. I repeat the Stephen Hawking quotation from the previous part. The greatest enemy of true knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. One of the other key passages that we took from Plato's Republic was the idea that population should be controlled and unwanted life should be disposed of like trash. In other words, that some were worthy of life and others weren't. This is a concept that comes through in Darwin's ideas about survival of the fittest. If we are evolving towards individual perfection by natural means, that would mean that collectively we are in fact evolving towards a utopian society of perfect men and women. However, in that case, those with perceived poor genetic material would be slowing that collective evolution, and so the whole process could be accelerated by getting rid of those who are not made of the right stuff. The end goal of a utopian society of purebred humans would justify the means of getting rid of the lesser ones. Remember that the full title of Origin of Species was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. One of the major influences on Darwin was a man called Thomas Malthus, who received the blessings of French deist Jean-Jacques Rousseau and famous Scottish philosopher David Hume. Incidentally, David Hume has a prominent statue on Edinburgh's Royal Mile, and if you look at the back of it, you will see this sun god symbol. Now, Thomas Malthus authored a document called The Essay on the Principle of Population, where he concluded that, amongst other things, society should adopt policies that prevent the human population from growing disproportionately larger than the food supply. Malthus, again finding a root in Plato's Republic, proposed genocide to make sure this didn't happen. Specifically, he thought to target the poor. He says, "Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders." Malthus believed that by such methods the undesirables in society could be effectively culled. He said regarding children, "We are bound in justice and honour formally to disclaim the right of the poor to support. To this end I should propose a regulation be made declaring that no child born should ever be entitled to parish assistance. The illegitimate infant is comparatively speaking of little value to society, as others will immediately supply its place. All children beyond what would be required to keep up the population to this desired level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the deaths of grown persons." The logic behind the idea that those who serve society least should be destroyed was echoed under Darwinism in the survival of the fittest. The individual is lost in the collective. Again, the end of a utopian society justifies the means of killing the poor and the weak. This naturally leads to another idea put forward by Plato, that people who are perceived to have pure genetic materials should be encouraged to breed amongst themselves to produce a race of supermen fit for ruling over the masses. This selective breeding is called eugenics. Eugenics actually found its Enlightenment-era origin in Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton. Galton regurgitated the thoughts of Plato in his work, Hereditary Genius, which was basically a racist tirade advocating a system of selective breeding for purposes of providing more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable. In other words, trying to artificially speed the upward course that evolutionists thought we were naturally already on. In truth, selective breeding had been practiced for some time amongst the elite. Inbreeding was commonplace amongst the ruling class to protect the genetic purity of their future stock. Galton merely took this idea and popularized it as a legitimate science. This very same tradition was in fact practiced by Charles Darwin himself in the hopes of maintaining a genetic superiority in his own bloodline. Darwin married the youngest granddaughter of his maternal father. Researcher Ian Taylor reveals the outcome of this project. Darwin's idea of inbreeding to produce superior stock can be seen to be a complete disaster in the case of his own 10 children. Of the 10, one girl, Mary, died shortly after birth. Another girl, Anne, died at the age of 10 years. His eldest daughter, Henrietta, had a serious and prolonged breakdown at 15 in 1859. 3 of his 6 sons suffered such frequent illness that Darwin regarded them as semi-invalids, while his last son, Charles Jr., was born mentally retarded and died in 1858, 19 months after his birth. Science has shown that inbreeding actually leads to speedier destruction of the genetic code rather than evolution because of something called biological mutations, which is why so-called purebred dogs are in fact more prone to health problems than mixes. The errors in their genetic code multiply as they are bred amongst themselves over long periods. But where true science fails, the religion of scientism continues stubbornly on. If they had followed God's wisdom in Leviticus 18, they would have heeded the warning not to commit incest, and they would have been all the better for it. In their own human wisdom, however, they persisted and reaped the consequences. The idea of eugenics continued to be promoted in the scientific community for a long time afterwards. At the turn of the 20th century, in 1901, the Statistics Department of London's University College became the headquarters for the Eugenics Education Society. Motivated by Galton's vision of a future utopia ruled by a genetically engineered pure elite, the Eugenics Society grew into a successful political movement and would eventually inspire Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews. Population control is still a big issue for the elite today. As recently as May 24, 2009, The Times reported of a secret meeting of billionaires held in New York City, including the likes of Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey, where the #1 issue on the agenda was how to cap the global population at 8.3 billion. Watch this short report by Hal Lindsey for a good overview.
According to a report in WorldNet Daily, some of the richest men and women in the world met secretly in New York recently. When the world's wealthiest individuals hold secret meetings, it's time to pay attention. In 1910, the 6 wealthiest men in the world met at Jekyll Island, Georgia. That meeting resulted in the creation, 3 years later, of the largest criminal enterprise ever devised, the Federal Reserve, so-called. Judging from the list of participants, the recent meeting in New York may result in something even more monumental. The London Times identified them as Bill Gates, David Rockefeller, Ted Turner, Oprah Winfrey, Warren Buffett, George Soros, and New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Based on the Forbes magazine list of billionaires, the room had a net worth of about $120 billion. With all the bailout figures we've heard recently, that doesn't sound like that much. Believe me, it is. $120 billion is about equal to the annual budget for all of New York State, from New York City to Buffalo and everything in between. The meeting, which took place in early May, was at the home of Sir Paul Nurse, a British Nobel Prize-winning biochemist and president of Rockefeller University. Microsoft's founder, Bill Gates, called the meeting. The London Times reported the informal afternoon session was so discreet that some of the billionaires' aides were told they were at security briefings. Discreet is the British way of saying secret. I do not believe that it is coincidental that this meeting came only a couple of weeks after another super secret and more powerful group met in the secrecy in Greece, the Bilderberg Group. They have advocated a one-world government for at least a century. They also see themselves as the elite saviors of mankind. According to the Times, the billionaires were each given 15 minutes to present their favorite cause. Over dinner, they discussed how they might settle on an umbrella cause that could harness their interests. Taking their cue from Gates, the report said they agreed that population control was the #1 issue. Experts say the global population will top 7 billion in 2012. According to reports at the meeting, Bill Gates outlined a plan to cap the global population at 8.3 billion. It all sounds so civilized, doesn't it? Here's the less politically correct but more accurate version. A group of unelected liberals with more money than many governments have just decided how many people will be permitted to live. This group of self-appointed governors will now have to draw up criteria to be used to decide who will not be permitted to live and how they will die. It can and will be dressed up in polite and civil terms, but in the end, it means certain people will have to die. The meeting was billed as a meeting of philanthropists wanting to do good. But one can put lipstick and pearls on a pig, and it'll still be a pig. In the final analysis, there's only one way to cap a population, by deciding who's permitted to live, and who, for the good of all, must die.
Now there's one final principle I want to highlight before we start moving through history again, and that's something called the Hegelian principle. Named after philosopher George Hegel, it is one of the most important ideas behind Darwinism, and it can be summed up by the idea that life evolves to harmony through conflict. That's harmony through conflict. That in any given situation there is a light and dark, positive and negative, that clash with one another to create a peaceful outcome, which is a mixture of the two. To put it another way, on one side you will have a thesis, and then directly opposed to it you'll have an antithesis. As the two come into conflict with one another, the inevitable result is a synthesis of the two. So very simply, thesis v antithesis leads to synthesis. Hegel was a pantheist who believed that you could see this happening in nature all the time. Freemasons and occultists everywhere believed that this basic principle could then be used to help bring about a singular one-world order. As I mentioned previously, one of the mottos of the Illuminati is "order out of chaos." Like eugenics, they attempted to artificially advance a process that they believed was already happening naturally. Because the goal of Satan was to reverse the scattering and fragmentation that had happened in Babylon to return the world to a singular system, the idea was to keep clashing opposing ideologies together to create conflict, which would eventually lead to peaceful solutions and unity, or synthesis in other words. Do this over and over and over, and with the passing of time, all ideas would converge back into a single point. So the idea of the Illuminati was to deliberately set up opposing ideas to one another in the knowledge that the conflict would eventually cause the two to compromise and reach a middle ground. British politics is a great example of the Hegelian principle in action. Originally there was a left-wing Labour Party and a right-wing Conservative Party, and they were very distinct and stood for very different ideas. Through the years of rubbing them up against each other, however, they have both now compromised and gradually moved into the centre ground, to the extent that the British public now has no real choice at the polling office. They are voting for basically the same ideas and the same party dressed in different colours. It's partly through the Hegelian principle that the world is gradually homogenizing and separate cultures are beginning to merge into one another. Sometimes the homogenization occurs naturally as the world gets smaller, and sometimes situations are deliberately manipulated and conflicts created to aid the progress towards a one-world order. Of course, where conflict between two opposing ideas is necessary to create a synthesis, bloodshed and violence has been encouraged by the elite. Remember, the Jesuits talked about stirring up conflict in places where there had been peace to further their cause. It's the same idea. The end justifies the means. From the conflict of World War I, for example, there came the League of Nations, which was a synthesis, an attempt to join countries together in unity for peace. Similarly, after the conflict of World War II, a synthesis was created afterwards in the United Nations, which exists to this day. We'll look at that more later. Wars are a win-win situation for the elite because they don't have to fight them personally, they help keep populations down, which is one of their main aims as we have already seen, and commercial enterprises often make a lot of money from them at the expense of taxpayers. And now, having taken the time to establish the principles of the Enlightenment and what they set out to achieve, we'll look at their first attempt at overthrowing monarchies and destroying Christianity, the French Revolution.